Ladies and gentlemen, happy Tuesday and Merry Christmas from your favorite commentator who gets zero paychecks for what he does and talks about on a weekly basis, multiple times a week, multiple hours per month. And we are back with another edition of the Shatter the Script episode brought to you by your host, Jared May. We return in grand fashion with College Football Playoff Committee finally deciding on, of course, based on the schedule, what the college football playoffs are going to be. Your first round buys, your first round matchups, your first four out, your bowl games, etc., etc., etc. We'll be going into that in detail, as well as of course, our Shatter the Script statement with Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and some other college football playoff committee, just kind of overhaul on how they should proceed with this in the future. I'm going to go a little bit through my NFL power rankings towards the end, based on what I saw this past weekend. We are recording on a Monday night, so we got Monday Night Football with Joe Buck and the Hall of Famer Troy Aikman. That'll be against the 4-8 Cincinnati Bengals and the 5-7 Dallas Cowboys in Jerry World. The roof was open. No metal was falling this time. Okay, so yeah, we had a great Stats and Scars episode last week. We did a really good job, in my opinion, of predicting the outcomes of the conference championship games. For instance, the SMU and Clemson one was kind of a head scratcher, but SMU played tremendously in the second half and just wasn't able to come out with a win. Arizona State, Iowa State, who gives a rip? Georgia and Texas really narrowed the score prediction down there, just maybe not so much as the winner, but I fully expected. Wouldn't be surprised that Georgia had won that game, which they did. So we'll probably bring up some recap in here when we get to the college football analysis. But per usual, if you're a first-time listener, you can find us at Shatter the Script across all platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. All at Shatter the Script. We're releasing clips, podcasts, new promotional content for season 3 of the Shatter the Script podcast. It's coming in March around that time. An official time plate will be announced probably closer to the Super Bowl. But it's going to be a fun season. I'm going to be a lot more bold in what I do, because it's kind of a make or break it attempt. And I got a lot of doubters. I got a lot of doubters out there that say you can't win. You're doing it the reversed way. Like, you're not supposed to. You're doing it backwards. You got to vulture off a major platform to find success and whatnot. Yeah, you might be right. But, hey, here's one thing that none of these, big-time major networks have that I do have, is the power of Christ and God's plan. So we'll see where that leads me. But, wouldn't it be awkward if a Shatter the Script guy worked for the script? What am I supposed to be, a double agent? No, all jokes aside, I'm being totally sarcastic. We're going to start with our Shatter the Script statement. And, this has to concern two AFC teams, the Chiefs and the Bills. And if you guys were watching the afternoon slate of NFL games this past weekend, you probably saw the very entertaining matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams at SoFi Stadium versus hosting the 10-2 at the time Buffalo Bills. And a lot of shit happened in this game. Obviously the score was 44-42, and Josh Allen once again broke another record for quarterback play in a single game 2 weeks ago against the 49ers in the snow. I believe it was 2 weeks ago. I think there was a bye week somewhere in there. He broke the record for having the only quarterback, I think, in NFL history to have a reception touchdown, a rushing touchdown, and a passing touchdown all in the same game. And then this past Sunday was the only quarterback in NFL history to have 3 pass touchdowns and 3 rush touchdowns in the same game. But yeah, the Los Angeles Rams, believe it or not, after reading those stats to you guys, came out with the victory 44-42. And so what I want to get into here is essentially why the Bills lost their game, and basically my complaint. I'll take it at an ulterior angle here, that analytics in some ways, sorry, the analyst, is kind of ruining football. And I think it's because, John Gruden has been joshing about this for a little bit now. It's like, sitting there in the radio booth or whatever and saying, "Oh, we gotta run here. Analytics say go for it," and you get stuffed on fourth down. And he goes, "Great job, you freaking idiot. We got stuffed. Now I got to answer to the press because your analytics told me to go for it." And this analytical part of the game is... Now, granted, I want to make myself perfectly, crystally clear here. I am not against analytics. I just think sometimes it's not like a blindly follow analytics thing. Sometimes just don't overcomplicate things is really all the true angle I'm trying to get at here. And... you see it a lot of times with a lot of NFL teams where they'll pop up on the screen and say, analytics say to go for it here. And you're just like, okay. But why? If you could, there was one, Arizona State ended one of their games. It was one of the games where the crowd rushed the field before the game was over. And the analytics was like, oh, we're not gonna just punt it here or run out the clock. We're actually going to run backwards 20 yards and then on the next play run around for 30 seconds and throw the ball away just so we can, erase time off the clock when you could have just either scored or kicked the field goal and it's over anyway. And so it's just a bunch of nonsense and silliness that is unnecessary when you just execute and get the job done and get out of there and let the analytics play their part in necessary scenarios. So that kind of brings me into the Buffalo Bills game. There was some blocked punts. There was no turnovers from Josh Allen. The Rams offense was just simply explosive. This is a very dangerous NFL team when fully healthy, which they have not been. Granted, the Rams essentially are the same exact team they were last year, now at 7-6. Going and creeping towards a playoff spot. That division is very tight. Anybody can win it. You got Seattle 8-5. I believe the Cardinals at 7-6, the Rams at 7-6, and the 49ers at 6-7. Who had the 49ers last in the division on their bingo card? Not me. But with the amount of injuries the 49ers have had this year, anything can happen. A lot like the Dallas Cowboys. But yeah, into this game, Josh Allen, like I mentioned before, 3 passing touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns, 0 turnovers, over 400 total scrimmage yards. The dude was an absolute monster. Now, they're down by 9 after a missed extra point from the Los Angeles Rams, and he's driving down the field. This is the 2-minute warning. Past the 2-minute warning, I believe. I think it was like 1:50 when they got the ball around that time. You have 3 timeouts. It's a 9-point game. You score a touchdown, you're a field goal away. And I mentioned to the medical guy and the analyst, I said, you cannot use a timeout here. You have to score without using a timeout. Well, they did a great job getting all the way down the field inside the 5 to the 1-yard line. They ran essentially a 5-wide quarterback sneak with Josh Allen, which, why not? I have no issue with the play call there. Maybe have done the second type of QB sneak after the timeout. But regardless, they run that play with about a minute left, and they get stuffed right at the goal line to bring up, I think, second or third and goal, to which Sean McDermott then calls a timeout. And you hear the announcers, which a rare sighting for Tom Brady, who announced this part of the game tremendously, in my opinion. But he said that timeout just cost them the game, and he's 100% right. Now, I don't know if my point with the analytics here is I don't know if the analytics told them to call the timeout to save a certain amount of time, but hindsight was 2020 when you moved into stopping the Rams with your 2 timeout, letting them chew the clock all the way down to 0 for them to take a delay of game and then punt it on 4th down, and the punt doesn't even land in time for you to have any time on the clock besides triple goose eggs. It costs them the game. And this is not the first time that Sean McDermott and his coaching staff has made play calls or late in-game management decisions that have cost the Bills a game. The first one was the Stephon Diggs versus Josh Allen game, Texans versus Bills. The Bills are inside their own 8, minimal time left on the clock, and they're just airmailing it. I mean, they are just throwing 20, 30 yards down the field inside their own 5.
to which they punt out of their own end zone inside their own 5 still, basically wasting 10 seconds on the clock, off the clock after 3 or 4 plays. And Texans get the ball at like midfield, run one play, a lot like the Clemson SMU game if you caught that one. Just literally just one play and then a field goal attempt, and the Texans won the game. This time, you had 3 timeouts remaining with about a minute to go. You called the timeout to run another play at the goal line, score on the next play. Essentially, that doesn't matter. Now you're within 2 points. It's 44-42. The Rams are leading. They get the ball back. They run 3 straight plays. They stop them 3 straight times, but in the 3rd time, they have no choice but to let the clock run. And then you do the delay of game all the way down to 0, punt, 0 time left in the clock, game over, you lose. You should have had that last time out to save and maybe have 20 or 30 seconds to let Josh Allen, the superhero of your team, maybe march down the field with 0 timeouts and get into field goal range for Tyler Bass to drill it inside of a stadium that is covered with 0 air or weather effects that would affect the kick outcome and win the game. That summarizes that game perfectly, and might I add, a very clean and sufficient sentence and paragraph from myself. And so I was very disgruntled with that decision from Sean McDermott from my couch last night, and I just, those types of decisions are what cost you 1st and 2nd seeds, home games in the playoffs, especially with the Chiefs, rolling through the AFC with black magic, which kind of brings me into the second portion of the Shatter the Script subject with the Kansas City Chiefs. Look, the last 15 games have been 1-possession games. And that is a crazy stat. I believe that's the correct stat. 15 games within 1 score. But I'm going to stick with what I know and say their last 4 or 5 games have been within 1 score. And that includes, the Broncos, the Raiders, the Chargers, the Panthers, and maybe one other team in there. I think before that it was the Buffalo Bills, which they were not within 1 possession of. So it might have been possessions, 15 straight possessions or some sort. Nevertheless, they've had basically 4 games within their last 5 or 6 to which they nearly escaped death. And they've been cheated out of it through a business model that the Kansas City Chiefs have prided themselves on, which is somehow coming out with a crazy victory no matter how terrible the offense plays. And I've been kind of saying it all year when I've talked about the Kansas City Chiefs, whether on Stats and Scars, whether on this show, whether on, if I mention it somewhere else, maybe on Twitter or some other social media platform, is that the Kansas City Chiefs are one of those teams that, creating their business model, which I was addressing earlier, that simply they have this aura about them to which they don't make the mistakes in the final 2 minutes. And whenever you watch Patrick Mahomes the first 8 weeks or whatever, he threw an interception his first 8 weeks. They've had some injuries to their receivers. They have kind of an old veteran tight end. Travis Kelce's now 35 years old, injuries to the running back, and yet they have found ways to win. And, the Broncos are not a bad team. The Broncos were in position to win, blocked field goal. The Raiders are a horrible team. They go down to the wire on Black Friday with the Kansas City Chiefs, and a strange false start call was negated and not called after they let the play run during the false start, and Aiden O'Connell fumbled on that play. Chiefs recovered. They said, no false start. We let the play run. Chiefs ball, game over. Very awkward. And then the next game, the Panthers take them down to the wire, almost into overtime, game-winning field goal there, or touchdown there. I can't remember which one it was, but another near-death experience for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then you go into the Los Angeles Chargers, which we predicted on the Stats and Scars episode, that some type of black magic would create a victory for the Kansas City Chiefs. And yet, of course, down 16-17 versus the Chargers. This is a very Charger-like game, I might add, and a Chiefs-like game. Doinks off the left field goal post into the field goal for a 3-point score and a victory for the Kansas City Chiefs. And I finally remember the point I was trying to get across earlier, is that if you've listened to me across any platform about when I've mentioned the Kansas City Chiefs, is that their defense has been louder, much, much louder than their offense. And obviously, I'm no idiot. I wouldn't say obviously, but hopefully I'm no idiot. But when you've gone through tremendous injuries to the offense, such as the Kansas City Chiefs have gone through this year, Isaiah Pacheco, Rashee Rice, and others like them, Hollywood Brown, and Xavier Worthy is exactly who I thought he would be, essentially another Mecole Hardman, and then you make the trade for DeAndre Hopkins, that he's still kind of getting implemented in the offense, Travis Kelce with the slow start. The defense is going to be louder than the offense, but like I've mentioned, this business model that the Chiefs have is annoyingly good. And it's one of those things where it's like I mentioned, the Kansas City Chiefs quite possibly can be the only team where the fandom experiences luck everywhere. Just like fortune and glory, like they mentioned in the Indiana Jones movie. Just like coming from a Dallas Cowboys fan, I can think of like 10 heartbreaking moments off the top of my head to where the cards didn't fall into my favor. But when you look at the Chiefs, I can think of like 10 instances this year alone where the cards fell towards the Chiefs' direction. And as a fan, I'd be of the Chiefs, like if I'm, talking in third person here, hypothetically, I'm obviously not a fan of the Chiefs, but I'd like to know how that experience is. Like, do you sit there and go, yeah, we got lucky? Or do you sit there and go, absolutely not. The Chiefs are the world champs. This is who we are. And like, I feel like it's probably cut 50-50 there, and it stems based on the delusion of a fan. And because if you allowed this type of these types of victories and this type of business model for a team like the Dallas Cowboys, and you knew what kind of fans the Cowboys have across the freaking country and the world, I mean, there would be crime against Dallas Cowboys fans across this nation, to which presidential candidates would have to run off of that alone to win the presidency. I mean, it would be so vast that you might see Stephen A. Smith locked in handcuffs for the amount of for how vocal the Dallas Cowboys fans would have been if they got this lucky this many times. And so that would mean reversing the Dez catch, Mason Crosby missing the field goal against the Cowboys' rookie year of Dak's career. It doesn't, all those sorts of things. And I just think it's very eye-opening if you're watching it as a fan, because you try not to hate senselessly and really just hate at all. You want to give love and respect to these teams, especially from a neutral point of view, like I've been encouraging myself to get better at. But it's really hard not to dislike the damn Chiefs. I mean, they're not playing well enough to win, yet they're winning, and it doesn't register in my brain. I can't convince myself that's a good team. I just have to sit there and watch it go, God, I mean, how can you come this close to, how can you be on the edge of losing 4 or 5 weeks straight and never lose when you got other teams that have been in one possession games and their record just suffers for it? And so I'm dumbfounded by the success of the Kansas City Chiefs, and I can only bring myself to the conclusion that I have to give props to of course, Andy Reid is one of the greatest, if not the second best coach of all time in my current era. But, at the same time here, I'm not hate watching, but I'd kind of like to see them lose so I can get off this train of, I think you're lucky, or I think you're doing black magic. I want to be against the grain here. And I looked at this Shatter the Script statement, and I brought it in here, and I'm looking, how can I be different than the rest rather than just call it black magic? Can I find it a reason to why this is happening? I mean, and I can't. Like the Shatter the Script statement that I can come up with is that this is black magic, that Taylor Swift is doing sign language in the booth and causing all of this to happen. And, maybe it's over because Taylor Swift just ended her,
whatever her Eras tour or whatever, and thank God that she can no longer harm the earth, with her emissions that she brings out in carbon. I'm getting carried away, but so maybe it's over. Maybe the spell has rung up, and she's got to whip up a new one. And I think this new one will include the Kansas City Chiefs essentially being the most dominant team in the league, and they'll win in grand fashion. But they've gotten so far ahead that they really can't screw up anymore. And something just seems to click whenever they hit playoff time. So that'll be interesting to see. And I'm just kind of dumbfounded is the Shatter the Script statement with the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, let's get into a little college football here. And kind of the back half of this Shatter the Script segment is the college football playoff rankings. And if you haven't seen it yet, I'll put up a visual up on the screen here in just a moment. But if you haven't seen it yet, obviously, no matter if it's 4 teams, no matter if it's 2 teams, no matter if it's 12, no matter if it's 25, there are always going to be those that whine and complain about being left out. There's always going to be those that should have gone in that didn't. And the committee is never going to get it right. And one reason that I don't think the committee's ever going to get it right is when they're sitting there all together in their conference room with one screen and no beer, no nicotine, no nothing, no cigars, no nothing in sight. I don't trust those people. If you're drinking, spirit water and everybody's in suits and ties, dude, I want to see some buffalo wings and ranch. I want to see some Miller Lite in a bottle. I want to see draft beer. Macallan 35 year on the rocks, old fashions. I want to see smoke in the room. Something to make me believe you're one of the boys. Watching the college football playoffs, because I can promise you a lot of the people like that probably have more sense than the committee does. And my issue with this isn't who got into the playoffs. You'll find out here in a second, I don't have any issue with who got in. I actually think they did a pretty good job with who got in. The conference championship winners getting first round buys is what I disagree with, because you'll see here, I'll bring it up actually now that we're finally mentioning it, but you'll see here that a lot of these teams have a pretty easy path to the college football playoff. And there it is up on the screen for you guys. And so you see you've got ranks 1 and 2, Oregon and Georgia. No issue with that. But then you got Arizona State and Boise with first-round buys hosting a home playoff game in the quarterfinal. And I just think that's an atrocity. Based on, they pride themselves on strength of schedule, and point differential, and conference championships and whatnot. And I look at Boise, and the most relevant team I can think of them playing was Oregon, who they played really close with. And Ashton Genty, went off on that team, obviously, like he's done against everybody. And I did say that they want Boise in the college football playoff because a Heisman candidate with a record like the team does, you're not going to want to miss this. You're going to want more eyes on Ashton Genty. And I understand Travis Hunter, I said, was a favorite of mine. I still believe that. But they're going to play at an Alamo Bowl, which people have taken issue of. It's like, never has a Heisman Trophy winner ever been out of the playoff, or why does he have to play in an Alamo Bowl or whatever the bowl they're playing is in? And it's like, well, Robert Griffin III experienced this as well when he won the Heisman with Baylor. So I don't really understand what we're getting at here, because your team didn't play in the conference championship. You played a weaker schedule than most SEC teams. You lost to Kansas. You almost lost to Baylor. I mean, your team didn't do well enough, and now you get to play BYU, who was literally in the same spot as you, but you don't see them Mormons bitching about it. But more so into what we have in the bracketology here, and I just think that that's the wrong way to go about it, is going by conference champions.
And obviously, Georgia winning the SEC Conference Championship and Oregon winning the Big Ten Conference Championship with a 13-0 record for Oregon and a 10-3 finalized record with Georgia beating Texas, who was higher ranked than them in the AP poll. That matters. And having Georgia's worst losses be against really good contenders, some who didn't make it, some who did. Two that didn't make it and one that did with a win over them earlier in the season, a dominating win away, I might add. I just think there's nothing special about Arizona here, Arizona State. Whoever wins this game between Clemson and Texas, which is a good matchup, by the way, for Clemson, that's a good pool. I assume Texas will win that game, and they'll go into Arizona State and just absolutely demolish them. No questions asked. I'll go back to playmakers. I'll go back to depth of team. I'll go back to strength of schedule and experience. Granted, Texas has been more favored with their SEC schedule. We went into the season saying, "Oh my God, they've got a slate they got to deal with. They've got like 4 rivalry games that they got to deal with." And then we went into the season, and after like week 4, we were like, "This is actually a cakewalk of an SEC schedule." Argue with the wall, but that's, in my opinion, what it was. They have one of the weakest SEC schedules out there based on current standings. However, they are a great football team and played Georgia like I thought they would. But they go into Arizona State. You're kidding me, right? I mean, you're kidding me. They're going to absolutely demolish them. And then you move over to the other side of the bracket with Penn State and SMU. SMU's got to go over to Penn State in the cold and beat this team who really kind of shocked me against Oregon, but SMU might be a little outmatched. I mean, they were playing from behind against Clemson the entire time, but these rankings, whoever wins that game goes into Boise State. If SMU went and played Boise, I could see that being a fantastic game. But if Penn State, with their depth, their strength of schedule, their experience, and I've had my criticisms about them all year, but you go in and play Boise State, I think they're going to absolutely demolish them. Move over to the top of the bracket. It gets better. Tennessee and Ohio State, both those seems to be a great matchup versus Oregon. But Oregon has a tough road. Like, that's formidable. But for the bottom half of this bracket to have an easy road is where I'm getting lost. Because if you went by AP standings, you would probably have Texas with a first-round bye, Penn State with a first-round bye, or Notre Dame. I would actually favor Notre Dame to get that 4th spot, Texas with that 3rd spot, and then you have Boise and Arizona State playing SMU and Clemson or Indiana in the first round. That makes a whole lot more sense to me. I mean, then you can get the scrubs out of the way, but you're not like paying attention in the quarterfinal with scrubs. Where you're like, oh, well, here we go again. It's TCU versus Bama, or whatever it was when Max Duggan was there. So I think that needs to be reevaluated in the future, and it won't. It'll probably take years for this to be reconstructed. The first 2 out, as you see on the bottom, was Alabama and Miami. I don't think Miami should have been there. They've been begging to lose for 6 weeks, and they lost 2 of those games. Alabama, and I'll get into it here in a second. My reasons why. But the Shatter the Script statement here with the 2025 college football playoff final bracket is that the college football playoff rankings based on conference champions getting the first 4 seeds in a home game and a first round bye, and then having that, group of 5 somewhere in there, I disagree with it. I just think it's the worst way to format it. And I think this first year of 12-team college football playoff showed that explicitly. So let's move on into my evaluation of the top 12 teams and seeds. And again, we're at 30 minutes for the Shatter the Script statement. I hit this on the nail basically every time, and it's on accident. I just kind of go, and whenever I'm finished, I look down at the clock, and it's between 29 minutes and 32 seconds. So grab you a water, get you another extra cup of coffee if you're at work. If you're staring at an Excel screen, keep working, and hopefully this motivates you to keep working harder, because it's going to be a long day. It's only Tuesday, and hopefully this makes your day a little bit more pleasant.
hearing my voice in your AirPods, your Beats Studios, whatever you're listening to on this easy Tuesday schedule. All right. Moving into the top 12 teams and seeds. And this kind of is an overview of whether I agree with who the top 12 teams were, essentially my 12th man, and who the first 4 teams out, do I agree or disagree? So, you had your top 2 seeds, Oregon and Georgia. I said earlier, I agree with that. Pac-12, I'm sorry, not Pac-12. RIP Pac-12. Big Ten and SEC champion, Oregon and Georgia. 100%. I believe those should be the number 1 and 2 seeds, and the cards fell in the way that they fortunately got the 1st and 2nd seed. Oregon has been impressive all year. I've got no complaints and no doubts with how valid they are. I mean, putting up 45 points against Penn State, being up 38-24 at one point, very dominating. Maybe it would have been different with Ohio State because they played a much closer game earlier in the regular season, but no doubts about Oregon. Georgia, when they're a concern going into the playoffs because of Carson Beck's UCL injury. But in terms of what they've done so far and winning the SEC championship, scoring 16 points in the second half, essentially with a backup quarterback, it was nice to see. Boise State and Arizona State, like I mentioned before, can't go off conference championship results. I just think it really tampered with the bracket. But you kind of, these 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, and 10 teams, I think, are perfectly fine. And that includes Texas at number 5, or the 5th seed, Penn State at the 6th seed. They were a Big Ten loser in the championship game. Notre Dame, independent, so they don't play a championship game, so they get kind of a free pass into maybe not dropping a seed in the college football playoff. But they've been impressive ever since their Northern Illinois loss, and they won their rivalry game against USC in grand fashion. Texas A&M goes to play USC in their bowl game later in December 27th. I'll be tuning into that and seeing how the team fares with USC. And then you get Ohio State 10-2. They lost that game at the end of the year. Missed out in a Big Ten championship after the loss to Michigan. Tennessee has been the same team all year long, essentially. It just kind of maybe exponentially growing in the passing game with their young quarterback. But they are absolutely college football playoff team. They're 100%. I'm a believer in Tennessee, and I am a believer that they can go in and beat Ohio State, which I'll get into later. Indiana, their point differential, their matchups, yes, they didn't play the greatest of matchups. They are a concern as they've been put on fraud alert pretty much all year, but they've shown the resume that they belong in the college football playoff, arguably over a team like Alabama. Now, would Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina go into Indiana and beat them? My argument is probably yes. I think those 3 teams would beat them. But sorry, Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina, you didn't do enough to get in, and I'll get into why that is later. SMU, they've played phenomenal all season long, 11-1 going into the American Athletic Conference. Their old conference yet again. Going into the ACC championship game at 11-1 and losing that game really because of a kickoff return at the end against Clemson, who is your 12th seed, the ACC champion. Who would have saw that coming? But Clemson, their 2 losses came from SEC schools, who everyone says is not as strong as you think they are. South Carolina being one of them, Georgia being the other. And the more that they've won, the more impressive it reflected on Georgia's schedule. So I don't disagree really at all with the 12 teams that got into the college football playoff. I really don't. I don't believe Alabama, Miami, Ole Miss, or South Carolina deserved a spot in the college football playoffs. And I've been super high on South Carolina, but I went back and reevaluated their schedule, and no, I don't think they did enough. I think they finished off on a high note,
and that recency bias really clouded the fact that there was some struggles with teams over 500 in the SEC. So let's get into these, and these will classify as my finalized TLC reference teams as my first 4 out. So starting with Alabama at 9-3, got to creep. And that is versus SEC teams over 500. They were 4-1. That is the most impressive out of the first 4 out against teams over 500 in the SEC. And that included Georgia, LSU, Missouri, and South Carolina. Beat all 4. And lost to whoever it was. But versus teams at or under 500, they were 1-2, which is what hurt them. Obviously, Vanderbilt and Oklahoma, both 6-6, losing on, I believe both were on the road. But you got to win those games. They win just one of those games they're in. Just one. And they really crumbled against Oklahoma late in the season when they're supposed to be blossoming as a team. But, you know, those two losses, I think, are what determines Alabama being out versus in. But they were absolutely the closest by a fraction amount, the first one out of the college football playoff, based on what they did this year. They were just, in my opinion, Alabama was very inconsistent, and that really tailored to Jalen Milroe's performance. Tennessee, that is the other one. That is the SEC team over 500 they lost to, away in a rivalry game. That Jalen Milroe, whether he could throw the ball or whether he could not throw the ball, was literally the difference maker of Alabama. I mean, plain as day. And could they compete in the college football playoff? Absolutely, yes. But I think they made the mistake in not adding him? No, I do not. I think they made the right decision. I think Alabama did not do its job with its schedule. If you are an SEC team with an SEC schedule and you demand to be in, you got to have the wins to do it. If you can play with the big boys, you're in the big boy league, you shouldn't be bitching about losing to the teams that are far less superior than you in the SEC. Hands down. Miami, 10-2, I don't want no scrubs. Now, their 2 losses came to Syracuse and Georgia Tech. And Syracuse did some damage. They are not a bad football team. But in terms of strength versus, you know, those other SEC teams, that is not a team you want to lose to if you're Miami. And not to mention the fact those games, the last 6 weeks, essentially begging to lose, you know, against Duke, against Virginia Tech, against Cal, against Syracuse, against Georgia Tech. I mean, if any of those teams that I listed, almost none of them are above 7 wins. In fact, maybe it's just Duke that is over 7 wins. And that's not good with an ACC schedule, quite frankly. I mean, just there's really no complicated or technical term to put there. That's just not what you want to see for a playoff team. 10 wins or not. So they're second on my list of the first 4 teams out, a lot like the visual I showed earlier in the show. And the biggest reason with Miami is they have no wins versus current top 25 teams. And I understand Indiana is also that way, I believe. I could be wrong. But they're very similar, I'll just say that. But the point differential, like Indiana was never really begging to lose ever throughout this year. That they honestly played pretty damn good defense against Ohio State. There were 2, I think, special teams touchdowns from Ohio State. They were playing away in Ohio State in the rain. That's a very tough thing to do. I kind of, you know, you would want to cut LSU some slack when they played Alabama, but they were at home and they got beat by like 30. So that's a difference. All right, third on my list of the first 4 teams out, and that is Ole Miss at 9-3, the official don't go chasing waterfalls. And I think I'll go with the same exact narrative that I had for Alabama. Versus SC teams over 500, Ole Miss was 1-3. I mean, what is Lane Kiffin complaining about? I mean, they are right where they belong, quite frankly. I mean, 1-3 versus teams over 500, and you demand a seat at the table?
like Yondu and Guardians of the Galaxy. I demand a seat at the table. I wear these flags the same as you. And like, no, like it's just not true. Like 1-3 versus teams over 500, and those losses included LSU, Georgia, and Florida. LSU with 8 wins, Georgia would finish with 10 wins, and Florida finished with 7 wins. Now, Florida is absolutely the worst loss out of that. They've lost to them away. In fact, I think, yeah. And so it's just, I want to say, did they beat Georgia? Hold on one second. People in the comment, or people watching the show are like, they beat Georgia. I'm literally just going to go here and find out and debunk myself. But yeah, let's see. I got to double check this. I wrote it in here for a reason. They beat Ole Miss. Okay, no wonder it was separated in my notes. Ole Miss beat Georgia. It was one of the teams over 500 that I noted as a win. LSU and Florida they did lose to, as well as another team. And so 1-3, like I mentioned, and then versus SEC teams at or under 500, they were 3-1. So the difference between Alabama and Ole Miss is Alabama beat the teams that they were either favored or not really favored to win against. Those teams where it's like, if you want to separate yourselves, you got to beat them 4-1. And Alabama didn't beat the teams they were heavily favored for, Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. That's Bama. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky. And they beat the teams. I mean, they're quite literally opposite. Versus SEC teams over 500 for Alabama, victorious. Versus SEC teams over 500 for Ole Miss, non-victorious is the difference. Alabama versus teams at or under 500, non-victorious. Ole Miss versus SEC teams at or 500, victorious. That is the difference between Ole Miss and Alabama. Moving into South Carolina, my last of the first 4 out. My official ain't too proud to beg. 9-3 team versus SEC teams over 500. This is where you can argue your strength of schedule because you can add Clemson in here too as a relative team on your schedule, which some SEC teams pulled and some SEC teams did not. For example, Texas pulled Michigan, A&M pulled Notre Dame, South Carolina pulled Clemson, so did Georgia. And so South Carolina 2-3 versus teams over 500. They lost to LSU, Ole Miss, and Alabama, and then they beat A&M and Missouri. Well, A&M and Missouri aren't in the talks to make the college football playoff. Ole Miss and Bama were. So you lost to both those teams, and might I add, I think by a pretty decent amount. That's why you're not going to be favored in. The committee has to look at all that, no matter how idiotic they can be. And then versus teams at or under 500, they were undefeated, victorious. So those are your differences between those 3 SEC teams. Why, if Bama can't get in, South Carolina absolutely cannot. If Bama can get in, Ole Miss can absolutely not get in there. And then Miami, they were just begging to lose. So that is your first 4 out analysis. Now, I debated whether or not I wanted to get into predictions for the first round of the college football playoff. And I think since we're doing well on time, I think I can get into it. And so we'll start first with number 10, Indiana, going to play at Notre Dame. And so we got Indiana, the 10th seed, Notre Dame, the 7th seed in the college football playoff. At Notre Dame, that's a very hostile environment for college football. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. Playing away in college football is the toughest thing to do in really any sport. It really is. If you go to the NFL, home and away games, in my opinion, don't matter near as much, and you can win easily with it. It's just basically you go off a different snap count, and it doesn't affect me in terms of the spread. Doesn't affect me in terms of performance. The only thing that has anything to do with NFL teams winning or losing outside of the teams, to me, is weather and coaches, and that's pretty much it. Which makes college football more exciting. So, Indiana going to play FBS independent school, Notre Dame. They've been on a roll as of late. I think Notre Dame is, for the first time in a while, not one of those overrated teams. I really think they can, if they play like they've been playing on defense since Northern Illinois, I really think this is a team that can do some damage in the college football playoff. I mean, I hate to say that because I have a large amount of dislike for Notre Dame. But Indiana, that is a tough challenge going all the way up there to Notre Dame and playing them at their place at this time of year. And so for those reasons, I think the depth in the secondary and our defense and the coach Marcus Freeman, the running back for Notre Dame, I think with all those pieces coming together for a big moment, I think Notre Dame wins this game 28-17 over Indiana. Now, I absolutely can see Indiana playing this one closer, but I really do think that is just a hard ask for Indiana to go in. And again, I'll use the argument why I think they lost to Ohio State is because they haven't really played much teams like Notre Dame. They're just not battle tested to where, Notre Dame also isn't much battle tested either. I mean, A&M week 1 counts as battle tested. I think they played Louisville at some point. We played USC to end the year, which USC, not to their credit, is not as good as they have been. They just haven't really been that great of a team the past 2 or 3 years. And then, so I've got Notre Dame winning that game in round 1. Number 11, SMU at number 6, Penn State in the college football playoff. This is essentially the same thing. Going into Penn State, probably a whiteout game, at that stadium, a very difficult environment to play in. SMU, it took them until the second half to get woken up against Clemson, who I had SMU beating. And granted, their offense completely dominated in the second half of that game, but Clemson did what it needed to do to win that game. But with SMU, they had a spectacular year this year with who they have in recruitment. I think what the future holds for SMU is beyond anybody's wildest dreams. I think the donors and the NIL deals in SMU in the long run are going to be extravagant. I just think this first year was a propellant for what the future holds for SMU, but will they do some damage in the playoffs? I think they got a bad pull with Penn State. Again, I have not been high on Penn State. I just think with their depth and their experience against top opponents that Penn State will win this game 31-26 at home. And in a playoff atmosphere, home games become an accelerant for difficulty. 1,000,000,000%. And I think you're going to see that for a lot of these visiting teams. Then we'll move into number 12 seeded Clemson at number 5 seeded Texas. Now, Clemson has, against ranked opponents outside of SMU, to my memory, such as Georgia, such as South Carolina, or I should specify, Clemson versus SEC teams this year has not performed well at all, and they're kind of the golden calf of the ACC, who had to play those SEC teams into where, like, when that argument says SEC isn't as strong as people say they are, and then they go and do what they did to Clemson this year, you're like, well, that negates that, because if Clemson can win the ACC championship and yet lose to South Carolina late the last game of the year and lose to Georgia at the beginning of the year by 30 points, then that negates that whole argument. So moving into this game, Texas hasn't been tested outside of Georgia twice, which I think is plenty to be tested, quite frankly. I mean, like, you play A&M away, that's a test. You play Michigan away early in the year, that's a test. You play Georgia twice, that's another test. I think both these teams are very evenly matched. I think it's going to be a low-scoring defensive ball game. I think Quinn Ewers is going to do enough to win this game 21-14. And it's kind of an odd score. I don't think I've ever really chosen 21-14 as a score. For some reason, I just think field goals don't play a factor in this matchup. And so I've got, and I'm going to be wrong on that, score predictions are impossible, but Texas 21, Clemson 14. Texas advances to the next round to play Arizona State and completely wipe them off the floor. lastly, this is the toughest one to predict, and I went a bold direction here. And so I've got number 9, the 9th seed Tennessee going to visit the 8th ranked Ohio State in the college football playoff first round. Ohio State, Ryan Day versus SEC teams, it is not good. Go look up his record against SEC teams. It is piss poor, terrible. Tennessee, I love their coach. I said he's a top 3 coach in the SEC. I truly believe that. I think it's literally probably Kirby Smart, Tennessee's coach, and someone else, yet to be determined. Sarkisian entered the SEC with a pretty stacked out roster. I'd like to see him do more with less, which is an impossible ask. I'm not 100% sold on Sarkisian, to be honest with you. And that's probably going to sound crazy to a lot of my Texas listeners. And going into this game, Tennessee has played quite a bit of teams. Ole Miss, they played Bama, they played Georgia. And with all those being said, and basically playing all those teams very close and winning the games that they were supposed to win, essentially, I have Tennessee upsetting Ohio State 24-23. And this, again, like I said, this is the toughest match to predict, but Tennessee, an SEC team going to play against Ryan Day, I say there's a pretty decent chance that this SEC defense for Tennessee clamps Will Howard and causes a lot of dysfunction. And a freshman quarterback going into a hostile environment like Ohio State does concern me, but I really think that defense kind of clouds the fact that this offense struggled against Ohio State, but it does just enough to put them in positive field position, to put them in scenarios for field goal or maybe defensive touchdown, special teams getting past positive territory, those types of things. I think Tennessee will play better at the 3 phases of the game than Ohio State will, which is literally creating a sliver of difference in this game. I do think Ohio State is a better team than Tennessee, though. So, all right. That would bring us to the following matchups in the quarterfinals. That would bring you Boise State versus Penn State, Arizona State versus Texas, Oregon versus Tennessee, and Georgia versus Notre Dame. And quickly kind of scouting out that, Boise State versus Penn State, I got Penn State winning. Arizona State versus Texas, I've got Texas winning by a mile. Oregon versus Tennessee, I've got Oregon winning that one by at least 7 or 10 points. Georgia versus Notre Dame, a very close game, but I've got Georgia. Whoa. It depends on Carson Beck. If Carson Beck is injured, I've got Notre Dame winning that game. It depends. I don't know if that rookie's ready to host that game quite yet. It's a Tua Tagovailoa situation with Jalen Hurts. You never know. But I could definitely see Notre Dame winning that game. So, but yeah, that wraps up the college football playoff outlook and heading in. It's very exciting. I cannot wait to watch it. I'm upset that it's coming to an end. I am just flat out really excited to see 12 teams finally in the playoff. I think that's a good format. Just change the conference championship credentials for first round bye. I think it's silly. All right. And we'll wrap this up with an easy pickings NFL power rankings. It's going to be very similar to last week, but we're going to start with my honorable mentions. And I've got basically at number 7, the Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers played a pretty damn good game against the Detroit Lions. More so on defense. I know they gave up 31, but I think they did their job to win that game. I think the offensive production was lackluster for the Green Bay Packers. I mean, Jordan Love only completed like 12 passes, just not his best performance. But the Green Bay Packers are, one of those teams where they're beating everybody else besides the Lions. So I think the Green Bay Packers will be cemented in the playoffs pretty soon. Right beneath them is another NFC North team. That is the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings are now, I believe, 11-2. Kirk Cousins, who they just played in Atlanta, has not thrown a touchdown in 4 straight games and has thrown 8 interceptions in 4 games. which, to be honest with you, I have not seen Kirk Cousins do that in a long time or ever, but I've seen him struggle, especially in primetime games historically. But can we finally say, I mean, I know Kirk Cousins is, getting in his older years, but can we never compare him and Dak again, please? I mean, clearly Dak Prescott is the better quarterback. I have to throw that in there. But the number 6, right outside of my top 5, is the Minnesota Vikings. Sam Darnold, 350 yards passing and 5 touchdowns. Jordan Addison is emerging as the clear-cut number 2 like he did last year. Justin Jefferson scoring 2 touchdowns. This team is for real, and they played the Detroit Lions within 3, and it'd be interesting to see how they finish out the year. But 11-2, I mean, they're in contention for a first-round bye if they continue to do their thing. So we'll see how that shakes out. Number 5 in my top 5 power rankings for Shatter the Script is the Kansas City Chiefs. They are 12-1 now. I've mentioned everything I've kind of I talked about at the beginning, the Shatter the Script statement. This black magic needs to end. They're the luckiest team in the NFL currently. I cannot find a better take than that. I really can't. But 12-1 kind of speaks for itself. I have to put in the top 5. But are they better than the 4 teams in front of them? I just don't think so. Number 4, the Pittsburgh Steelers. They just continue to win. Now they're kind of putting the offensive pieces together. They won without George Pickens, their diva receiver, against Cleveland pretty argumentatively very easily. They dropped that game against the Browns earlier this year. Like I mentioned before, 2 things that matter to NFL game: weather and coaches. And in that instance, the weather. The second half happened. It was kind of a close game. Literally, you go into settings and turn on even teams because the snow just covered the entire football field in the second half. Even teams are on, and the Browns ended up being victorious with that. But the Browns are not a good team at all, and they did what they were supposed to do when it didn't snow in a very eye-opening way. I mean, I think it was 27-14. It was and there was a garbage time touchdown in there. Number 3, Philadelphia Eagles. Now, they nearly escaped the Panthers on a comeback drive. Bryce Young continues to play pretty damn well. Xavier Legette dropped a touchdown reception to basically ice the game at the end. But Jalen Hurts, I mean, they're at 3. I probably could have put them at 4 or 5, but they're at 3 because, I mean, of the role that they've been on. I don't think the Commanders really pose a threat to the Eagles in this division. The Commanders currently sit at 8-5. I think eventually they're going to fall apart and deteriorate towards maybe a 10-7 record, a lot like the Cardinals would do with Kyler Murray. But the Eagles, with Saquon Barkley and the receivers finally healthy again, bless me. I think they belong at number 3, strictly because their MVP candidate Saquon Barkley is absolutely incredible, and he's had a lot of rushing touchdowns vultured from him because all they want to do is tush push at the goal line, which is, again, one of the most annoying things in the NFL. It's like one team does that. Okay, so not like, how has no other team figured out how to do that? It boggles my mind. Number 2 is the Buffalo Bills, coming off a 40-point loss to the Los Angeles Rams at SoFi Stadium. But however, Josh Allen scored 6 touchdowns and no turnovers. He continues. I literally said, if you want a clear-cut MVP candidate, he just needs to catch up in touchdowns. And his past 2 games, I think he scored like 9 touchdowns total. He's been an absolute menace on the field. Amari Cooper getting more into the action. One thing that concerns me with the Bills is I don't understand how their run game truly works, because James Cook, I think, only had 6 carries in this one, but they have this thing where a random running back will score a touchdown or get a big gain, and it's either Ty Johnson or Ray Davis just randomly will go off on one play, and then they just awkwardly use the 3 running backs in almost like a non-strategic way, when clearly James Cook is your most effective back. I think his last 2 games have been under 50% snap share. So, odd one to me. I think if they figured out a run game of some sorts and were putting less stress on Josh Allen, it would eliminate some of these closer games that should not be close. But one thing's for sure, you can absolutely count on Josh Allen to get you back into really any game with what he's been doing as of late this year. The Detroit Lions, clear-cut number one. I don't see them moving out of the number one spot moving forward. The Detroit Lions play calling with Ben Johnson, their aggressiveness with Dan Campbell, the allegations of them having a bounty on their team, I think are real. I think it's a possibility that they are going, especially players like Kirby Joseph, but, innocent until proven guilty. But this is an aggressive team on defense. They've dealt with some pretty significant injuries on defense. You flip back over the offensive side, Sonic and Knuckles, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Laporta's starting to catch a little fire. Brock Wright is the best blocking tight end in the nation, in the world. Brock Wright is amazing. Brock Wright should join the show. Shout out to Brock Wright. And I think the Lions will not move from that number one spot for the rest of the year unless they just flat out crumble. But I would hate for any NFC team to play this one. Hopefully, my dream scenario for Super Bowl is the Detroit Lions versus the the Detroit Lions versus the Buffalo Bills. That's my dream world scenario. I think that would be a lot of fun to watch. Electric, two high-flying offenses. Jared Goff getting a revenge Super Bowl, maybe scoring more than 9 points this time. But if we got a Detroit Lions versus Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl, get ready to see the same exact Super Bowl that Jared Goff was in when he played Tom Brady, and it was like 13-9 final. And then have the Chiefs win again. So get ready for that. But yeah, that concludes today's episode. I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover. We got the Shatter the Script segment with the Bills timeout versus the Rams, the Chiefs Black Magic win, the college football ranking, having to reevaluate conference championship seeds and whatnot. The college football playoff top 12 teams. Do I agree or disagree? First 4 teams out, my cemented TLC references, and some predictions for the first round of the college football playoff, which we will get into more in the Stats and Scars episode coming up on Thursday. So, with all that being said, it has been fun to get back on the mic on a consistent basis and give y'all a Shatter the Script episode every Tuesday. Keep in mind, more promotional content will come out for Season 3. It kind of put a teaser out there for what the logo is going to be. I find it to be super hilarious and at the same time awesome. I think the motto is going to align perfectly with what we're trying to do with this podcast and platform. Perhaps next year, I will actually consider incorporating new guests into the show and possibly more contributors. And we will see how that shakes up. I'm still formulating a plan, but I'm excited for year 3 with this podcast, and I've had a lot of fun doing it. I know it has not made me a single cent. It has cost me. I'm in the hole way more than I've made on this podcast, obviously, but I love doing it. I hope you guys share it with your friends. I really do. Because I think they would enjoy a lot of what I talk about. And when you listen to it and you know who I am, just know my name and have met me, maybe not listen to it like that. It isn't, your friend from the street. It's a different way of hearing sports is what I would encourage you guys to tell your listeners and say, hey, look, he does it this way. He goes into against the grain of the mainstream media to where you don't have to go to Stephen A. Smith and roll your eyes or Big Dog or, look at all these different new hires from all these new corporations and think, why are they on there talking sports? The full 9 yards. There is no agenda that is being controlled here. It is fully authentic. It's real. It's go and look at the facts and present to you the truth. And that's what I pride this channel on. So I hope you guys share with your friends. Again, you can find us at Shatter the Script and subscribe, follow, and like our YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast channels at Shatter the Script. Or you can follow us for video content on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. So we will see y'all on Thursday for Shatter the Script. For Stats and Scars. Next week on Tuesday for another edition of the Shatter the Script. Thank y'all and have a blessed day. Oh! Cheddar!